Right here on the Tech Yes desk, we have the Elusive Radeon Fury. Now, I finally got my hands on one of these in a used parts hunt where I got it for 150 Aussie dollars. If you haven't seen that parts hunt, I'll put the link up here where I got a heap of other epic deals while I was out getting this one right here. But I finally got my hands on one. It's been evading me for some time because whenever they've come up, they've gone up for a price that I'm not prepared to pay, especially since when I look for a graphics card, I'm looking at its price performance, and that's what we're going to be testing here today with the Radeon Fury 4GB model versus the RX 570 4GB model. Now this comes from an era where AMD had 28nm, they had like the R9 390, 390X, and then they made the Fury and also the Fury X, which was a beefed up version of this with a water cooler. This is the Strix edition here. It's got three 90mm fans and it weighs in at 1.1 kilograms. And we're going to be comparing that to the RX 570 4GB model as well to see which of these is the midweight champion for price performance. Now, of course, this is going to use up a lot more power than the RX 570 since it's got two 8-pin connector ins. This has only got one 8-pin power connector in. And of course, the RX 570 is on 14nm as well. But with that out of the way, we're going to do a 1080p showdown on these two cards to see if the Fury is worth it if you're in the market for something of price performance and you don't care a whole lot about power consumption or of course where you live, power is cheap. But before we do that, the person I bought this off, they actually said they knew who I was, and they also said I wouldn't need to be giving this GPU any Tech Yes loving because they already cleaned it. However, upon further inspection, I saw that that sticker is still intact on the screw holes, which means that the GPU thermal paste hasn't been replaced, and while we're at it, we might as well give it some quick Tech Yes loving. So the Radeon Fury was a very interesting card for its time because it was the first gaming graphics card to use Hbm memory, and this was the first generation, and ironically they could only fit 4GB of VRAM on the Fury and the Fury X. And you can see this on the die here where that memory is actually located right next to the GPU itself rather than your GDDR5, which would go around the die and give a little bit more breathing room. But because it was the first time a GPU had lower VRAM, then a card lower in the stack, and we're talking about the R9 390 and 390X 8GB models. Now the Fury itself was actually a cut down version of the Fury X, and that had 4096 stream processors, where the Fury had 3584. It did have the same memory, it did have the same memory bus of 4096-bit and a bandwidth of 512GB, but this bandwidth meant that the memory clocks itself was at a lower speed, 500 MHz, or basically in GPU terms, 1000 MHz effectively. The one thing you may notice is they've used a thermal pad instead of using thermal paste. And now reasons for doing this could come to the fact that they might not want the GPU to risk cracking, because if you've got a cooler mounted directly to the GPU and it gets too hot and the heat expands and then contracts, that can risk ruining the actual GPU itself in the form of cracking the die. That would probably be the only reason I could think of why they used it on this GPU, since we're looking at the die size, and that is absolutely massive. It's one of the biggest GPU die sizes in history of graphics cards. But regardless of this isn't going to stop me from putting some thermal paste on, putting some washers on the back, and then testing out the temperatures and seeing how well this card performs. So now we've been running this benchmark for a little over 5 minutes already, and it's starting to throttle a little bit under that 1 GHz core clock. So unfortunately for the Strix here, we won't be doing any overclocking on this GPU, which is sad because the Strix is known to be one of the best air coolers out there on the market. It's also using over 390 watts at times, so that's more than a 2080 Super, and it's coming in the realm of a 2080 Ti sometimes. So we finished up the benchmarks with the Radeon Fury, and coming into this, I gotta say, I was kind of like sure that I was gonna lean into the fence of don't even bother with a Fury or a Fury X and just go for an RX 570 or an RX 580. But after doing the benchmarks here, and we'll just pull up some of the numbers we got here at 1080p, we can see that in Strange Brigade, the Fury handed a smackdown to the RX 570. And then we're moving on to F1 2019. It was a similar story. It was handing another smackdown, and these are both OC models too. Like the Strix is, I guess, well, probably not an OC model for the Fury, since it pretty much throttles a little bit. It does hit that maximum temperature, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. The Gigabyte is an Aorus OC model as well. We can see that the numbers are heavily favoring the Fury in these first two titles, but we move over to Dota 2. It was actually the opposite side of the fence, where we got 175 average FPS, and then for the Fury we got 170. Moving over to Far Cry New Dawn, the Fury did flex a little bit, but it wasn't as big as those first two titles, 72 versus 66 average FPS. And then moving on to Shadows of the Tomb Raider, we saw an actual equal score here of 55 versus 55 at 1080p highest settings. So whether that has to do with the 4GB VRAM limit on place, especially in the case of Shadow of the Tomb Raider, is up in the air, since this does use Hbm memory versus this card right here, which is using GDDR5. So the Hbm memory, it does add more bandwidth, but of course, since it does have still a limit of 4GB, it's still going to incur limits on that VRAM itself. And back in the day, I remember with the Fury, a lot of people said, oh, it's got higher bandwidth, it's going to do a lot more with its VRAM than the other cards that have GDDR5, for example, could do with their VRAM. And guys, a VRAM buffer is a VRAM buffer. It's that simple. I mean, if you're coming into problems with memory speeds, then that can relate to performance if it can't fill the buffer fast enough. But in terms of what can fill inside that buffer, that's not getting any better the bigger the bandwidth gets, if that makes any sense. So it was a really interesting time for AMD, where they were clearly trying to do the best with what they had. And in terms of the Fury, it was just putting out a lot of heat. When we pull up this power consumption results here, we can see RX 570 is doing about 280 watts. The Fury is doing about 370 watts. So we've got an extra 90 watts power draw on this whole system alone. And in some titles, we're getting similar FPS. Now the Hbm memory, this was Gen 1, and we can see just by the sheer massive size of the die of this thing right here, that it was a huge thing to keep under control. A die that big is obviously made that big for a reason, and that's going to put out a lot of heat, especially when you're in games. And so the Strix model here with its 1.1 kilo cooler, 3 fans, 90mm fans, it had a tough time keeping this GPU under control, to the point where I couldn't get any overclocks out of it. And even then, you wouldn't want to get any overclocks out of this unit, since it's already throttling out of the box after a good 10 minutes on a stress test. And so that will affect your numbers slightly, but for what it's worth, it is geared up with this cooler to run pretty much optimal settings out of the box. And when we compare that to the Aorus, this is actually overclocked out of the box, and its stock cooler is pretty much hitting its limit. You don't really want to overclock this, unless of course you're going to ramp the fan speeds up to 100%, which is going to create a lot more noise, but you will manage to get some better scores in comparison to the Fury. Then it all comes down to it, I was actually surprised that in some of the titles, this was coming out well ahead of the RX 570. Now, for 150 Aussie dollars, I gotta say, besides the fact that it does chew up a bit more power than I'd like it to, it does perform quite well. And as I said, just coming into this outro bit, I thought that coming into this, I was kind of like, the Fury's gonna be a worthless purchase, it's not gonna be worth the money, but running these benchmarks really changed my mind in that it still can perform in 2019. And it just depends on the title. I mean, if you manage your settings, and as I always say, if you've got a graphics card with a 4GB VRAM limit and you're running the maximum settings, you may wish to tune things down so you're not hitting that 4GB VRAM limit. So for what it's worth, this card right here, it can be a pretty good purchase, especially for the money if you find it at the right price. And here's the ironic thing about this card. As I've said in the past, it's so hard for me to get my hands on one of these GPUs. They're very elusive, and the fact is they just weren't sold as much as a lot of other cards out there. For instance, I see a lot more R9 290s, R9 390s on the market than I do than these. And so this coming in at 150 Aussie dollars, around about 100 USD, was actually a pretty good deal, since it does in a lot of the cases get about 20% more performance than an RX 570, and even then it'll trade blows with an RX 580, and that's a pretty good thing since an RX 580 generally costs a little bit more than 150 Aussie dollars. So all this now brings me to the conclusion of the Radeon Fury, and is it worth it? And of course, anything can be worth it if you get it for the right price. I think at 150 Aussie dollars and 100 USD roughly, it would be worth it. It's actually a decent buy, but keep in mind it does come with a few drawbacks, and actually quite a few, and that is of course that power consumption and the fact that it's going to be running hot. And so when you've got that extra power consumption, you see me in the past, I'm using these cookie cutter cases, especially when I'm flipping PCs, you're really gonna be hard pressed to be using this in a cookie cutter $40 or $30 case. And the reason being is because those cases generally have poor airflow. And so you dumping another 90 watts inside that case is really gonna heat things up and heat things up quickly, not just for the GPU where it's gonna throttle even worse, but also for the rest of the components inside the build. So if you're gonna get one of these, keep in mind that you're going to need a better power supply, you're going to need a better case. And so that leads me to the point of, I wouldn't be looking for these unless you find them for a really good deal. And even then, if you find one, do be prepared to cough up some extra money in terms of the other augmented things that you're gonna need in terms of getting this running properly. So basically, in a nutshell, the Radeon Fury and also the Fury X would be GPUs that I wouldn't personally buy in bulk, but that being said, if they came up at the right price and everything else in your area like RX 570s, RX 580s and GTX 1060s were all overpriced and these just happened to come up at a really good price, then I'd definitely snap it up if it was the right price. Because ultimately it is a card that can still deliver the FPS in 2019, and call me a little bit weird, but the picture quality coming out of these older cards, like the GTX 7 series and also the Radeon Furies and stuff like that, I felt like it was a more raw image. Nowadays you've got so much compression going on with your new AMD cards as well as your new NVIDIA cards that I feel at the very least a little bit of detail is lost in translation. Though with that said, I hope you guys enjoyed today's comparison between the Radeon Fury and the RX 570. If you did, then be sure to hit that like button for us. And also let us know in the comments section below, if these two cards were the same price, which would you pick and why? Love reading your thoughts and opinions as always. And before we get on out of here, today's question of the day comes from Tristan Lee. And it's actually not really a question, but it's something I got to address because in the last month, I've been seeing a lot more, in particular, just comments about AliExpress. And he says, wow, this man really bought PC parts off of AliExpress. And I don't know what it is about the anti-AliExpress people out there. I do get the people who hate the shipping times. Sometimes the shipping times can be like a month or more, but I've been using AliExpress for over 3 years and I haven't had one bad experience. I've always got the stuff I've ordered. For instance, I've just ordered a heap of stuff right here. We got the 6 heat pipe version of the Snowman. I'm really keen to do another look at that. I got some DDR3 and DDR4 memory for an upcoming video where we're gonna be testing some stuff like there. I've got an A320 Earthshaker. I wanted to check out a budget $40 A320 off AliExpress. And then we got this Johnsbow C2 case here, which apparently is like micro ATX. But the thing is about AliExpress is that the parts are usually very cheap and anyone in the world can get these readily available. You don't have to go through the trouble of deal hunting. For instance, a Snowman for like 20 bucks. I don't have to go down my PC shop and go, okay, what air coolers have you got? Waste my time and then get something that ends up costing more than this here and most likely performs worse. I mean, when I tested out the Snowman cooler, I was shocked at the value for money that was bringing to the table. So AliExpress is one of those things that's starting to become a lot better as more people adopt it. But in terms of the service and the quality of products you get, it's really good value for money. And that's why I keep using AliExpress. And I'm a big fan of using a lot of the stuff off there. You're getting stuff sent directly from the source rather than going through a ton of middlemen to get to you. And with that aside, I hope you enjoyed this video. I will catch you in another tech video very soon. And if you've made it this far and you haven't hit that sub button, you may wish to, and ring the bell while you're at it so you get the videos the moment they drop, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace out for now. Bye.